King Alexander stood at the tall windows of Thornwood Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the gardens where he had once played as a child. His reflection in the glass showed a man aged beyond his 52 years, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did this morning. Behind him, the ornate doors of his private study opened with a soft click. He didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. Lady Victoria Ashworth had been his companion for nearly 15 years, through the darkest period of his life following his divorce from Queen Isabella. Victoria's presence had been both comfort and controversy, a relationship that had weathered countless storms of public opinion and royal protocol. "The Prime Minister is waiting in the Blue Room," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying the familiar strain that had become more pronounced in recent weeks. She approached slowly, her elegant figure draped in a cream silk dress that had once made his heart race but now served only as a reminder of all they were about to lose. Alexander finally turned, taking in the woman who had stood by him through scandal and triumph alike. Victoria's auburn hair was perfectly styled as always, but he could see the exhaustion in her emerald eyes. The constant pressure from Parliament, the Church, and his own advisors had taken its toll on both of them. "Victoria," he began, his voice heavy with the words he had rehearsed 100 times but never found the courage to speak. "We both know what this meeting is about." She nodded, her composure never wavering despite the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. "The Archbishop made his position quite clear yesterday. The Church will not accept me as Queen Consort, no matter how long we wait or how much public opinion may shift." The previous day's meeting had been brutal. Archbishop Montgomery had been respectful but firm. The Church's stance on Alexander's relationship with Victoria had not changed in 15 years and would not change now. If Alexander insisted on making Victoria his queen, the Church would withdraw its support for his reign. In a constitutional monarchy where the Church's blessing remained crucial, this would create a crisis that could tear the kingdom apart. "There's something else," Alexander said, walking to his desk where a folder of photographs lay waiting. "Something I haven't told you about yesterday's meeting with the cabinet." Victoria's eyes followed him, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "What do you mean?" "They presented me with alternative solutions," he continued, his fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "Ways to secure the succession while maintaining stability." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Victoria had always known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. She had watched from the sidelines as younger royals married and had children, as the line of succession remained uncertain with Alexander's only heir being his distant cousin. "They want you to marry someone else," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Alexander opened the folder, revealing photographs and biographical information about several potential candidates. Young women from noble families across Europe, all photographed at various royal functions and social events. But one photograph stood out among the rest, and Victoria's breath caught as she recognized the face. "Lady Catherine Pembroke," Alexander said, noting Victoria's reaction. 28 years old, daughter of the Duke of Westmere. She's been working as a curator at the National Museum for the past 5 years. No scandals, no controversial past, and, most importantly, the Church approves of her family lineage. Catherine Pembroke was beautiful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. Her dark hair framed delicate features, and her smile in the photograph suggested both intelligence and warmth. Victoria had met her briefly at several state functions over the years, and had always been impressed by the young woman's grace and genuine nature. "She's lovely," Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And she would make a good queen." "That's not the point," Alexander said firmly, moving away from the desk to take Victoria's hands in his. "You know how I feel about you. 15 years, Victoria. 15 years of building a life together, of supporting each other through everything." Victoria pulled her hands free gently, walking to the same window where Alexander had been standing. The gardens below were coming to life with the morning sun, gardeners tending to the roses that had been planted for Queen Isabella decades ago, and had somehow survived every change of season since. "But you also know your duty," she said, her reflection joining his in the glass. "The kingdom needs stability. The succession needs to be secured. And she paused, her voice catching slightly. "I knew this day would come eventually." "I won't do it," Alexander declared, his voice rising with emotion. I won't sacrifice what we have for political convenience. Victoria turned from the window, her eyes now bright with unshed tears, but her expression resolute. Alex, listen to me. Look beyond your feelings for a moment, and think about what's best for everyone. She moved to the folder on his desk, lifting Catherine's photograph with steady hands. This woman deserves more than to be a political arrangement. And you deserve more than to tear your kingdom apart for a love that was never meant to be. Don't talk like that, Alexander protested. What we have is real. It's been real for 15 years. Of course it's real, Victoria replied, setting the photograph down carefully. But it's also complicated in ways that will never be resolved. The church will never accept me. Parliament grows more restless each year. And the people. She paused, thinking of the latest opinion polls that showed a kingdom divided on their relationship. Alexander slumped into his desk chair, the weight of his position pressing down on him like never before. So what are you saying? That I should just cast you aside and marry someone I've barely spoken to? I'm saying that perhaps it's time we both considered what we really want for the future, Victoria said, approaching his chair and kneeling beside it. I've loved you with everything I have, Alex. But I've also watched you struggle with this burden for years. The guilt, the constant pressure, the way you second-guess every decision because of how it might affect us. She took his hand again, this time holding it firmly. Maybe it's time we both found peace. Peace? Alexander looked at her incredulously. How can there be peace without you? Because you would finally be free to be the king you were meant to be, Victoria said softly. And I would be free to live without the constant scrutiny, without being the reason for constitutional crises and church disputes. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking time that felt increasingly precious. Alexander studied Victoria's face, seeing determination mixed with sorrow, love mingled with resignation. And Catherine? He asked finally. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. From what I know of her, she's intelligent, kind, and genuinely cares about public service. She's not looking for fame or fortune. She's dedicated her career to preserving history and culture. That doesn't mean she wants to marry a king she barely knows. No, Victoria agreed. But it means she understands duty and sacrifice. And perhaps, in time, you could find something real with her too. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where portraits of his ancestors watched from gilded frames. Kings and queens who had made difficult choices for their kingdoms, who had put duty before personal desire, who had found ways to serve their people even when it cost them personally. I need time to think, he said finally. Victoria nodded, rising gracefully from beside the chair. The Prime Minister is still waiting. Tell him I'll need until tonight to make my decision, Alexander replied, not turning from the portraits. And Victoria? Yes. Whatever happens, know that these 15 years have been the happiest of my life. After Victoria left, Alexander remained alone with the ghosts of his ancestors and the impossible choice before him. Outside the window, life in the kingdom continued as it always had, unaware that their king was about to make a decision that would change everything. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the study where the future of a nation hung in the balance between love and duty. Lady Catherine Pembroke stood in the hushed halls of the National Museum, carefully adjusting the lighting around a newly acquired collection of medieval manuscripts. The ancient texts seemed to whisper stories of kings and queens, of political marriages and royal scandals that had shaped the kingdom for centuries. She had always found solace in history, in the way the past provided perspective on the present. Her peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of her assistant, Marcus, whose usually calm demeanor was replaced by barely contained excitement. Lady Catherine, he said, slightly out of breath from hurrying through the museum's long corridors. You have visitors. Very important visitors. Catherine frowned, checking her appointment book. I don't have any meetings scheduled for today. It's the palace, Marcus whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow break the gravity of the situation. The king's private secretary is here, along with 2 other officials. They're waiting in your office. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. In her 5 years as a curator, she had occasionally liaised with palace officials regarding historical exhibitions and cultural events, but never had they come to see her personally without prior arrangement. She smoothed her navy blue dress, tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and made her way to her office with as much composure as she could manage. 3 distinguished men in dark suits rose as she entered. The eldest, whom she recognized as Sir Edmund Fitzroy, the king's private secretary, stepped forward with a formal but kind smile. "Lady Catherine, thank you for seeing us without notice," Sir Edmund said. "I'm afraid we have a rather unusual matter to discuss with you." "Of course," Catherine replied, gesturing for them to sit while her mind raced with possibilities. Had she made some error in a royal exhibition? Was there a problem with one of the palace's loaned artifacts? Sir Edmund exchanged glances with his companions before speaking again. "Lady Catherine, what I'm about to tell you must remain strictly confidential, regardless of your response to what we're about to propose." Catherine nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their slight trembling. "His Majesty finds himself in a position where he must make certain decisions regarding the future of the monarchy," Sir Edmund continued. "After much consideration and consultation with various advisors, your name has been put forward as a potential candidate for a very significant role." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Catherine felt as though the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. She had studied enough royal history to understand what was being suggested, even before it was explicitly stated. "You're asking if I would consider marrying the king," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "We are," Sir Edmund confirmed. "I know this comes as a shock, and we certainly don't expect an immediate answer. But the situation has reached a point where His Majesty must make a decision, and he wanted you to be aware of the possibility before any formal announcements are made." Catherine was silent for several long moments, processing the magnitude of what was being asked of her. She thought of King Alexander, whom she had met on several occasions during royal visits to the museum. He had always been courteous and seemed genuinely interested in the historical collections, but their interactions had been brief and formal. "May I ask why me?" she finally said. "Surely there are other candidates who would be more suitable." The second man, whom Sir Edmund introduced as Lord Hartwell from the Cabinet Office, leaned forward. "Your family lineage is impeccable, your education and career demonstrate intelligence and dedication, and you have shown a genuine commitment to public service. More importantly, you have conducted yourself with dignity and discretion in all your public appearances. And," added the third man, Sir Richard Blackwood from the Church Council, "your background meets all the requirements set forth by the Church and Parliament." Catherine understood the unspoken implication. Unlike Lady Victoria, whom everyone knew held the king's heart, Catherine represented a choice that would satisfy all the institutions that matter to the monarchy's stability. "What about Lady Victoria?" Catherine asked directly. Everyone knows of His Majesty's feelings for her. Sir Edmund's expression grew somber. "That relationship has reached an impasse that cannot be resolved. Lady Victoria herself understands this, though I'm sure the decision weighs heavily on all parties involved." Catherine rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the museum's courtyard. Students and tourists moved peacefully below, unaware that a conversation taking place just above them could change the course of the kingdom's history. "You realize," she said without turning around, "that you're asking me to enter into a marriage that would essentially be a political arrangement. His Majesty and I barely know each other. Many royal marriages throughout history have begun as political alliances and grown into partnerships of mutual respect and affection," Lord Hartwell said gently. "No one expects you to feign emotions you don't feel, but there is hope that understanding and perhaps even fondness could develop over time." Catherine thought of her work with historical documents, of the letters between royal couples she had catalogued and preserved. Some told stories of duty that blossomed into love, others of respectful partnerships that served both crown and country well, even without passion. "I would need time to consider this," she said, finally, turning back to face the three men. "And I would need to speak with His Majesty directly before making any decision." "Of course," Sir Edmund agreed. "His Majesty specifically requested that if you were willing to consider the proposal, he would like to meet with you privately to discuss the matter openly." "When would this meeting take place?" "Tomorrow evening, if you're agreeable. A private dinner at Thornwood Palace, away from any official protocols or public scrutiny." Catherine nodded slowly. "I'll need to inform my father of these developments." "Naturally," Sir Edmund said. "The Duke of Westmere should certainly be consulted. We would ask only that the circle of knowledge remain small until a decision is reached." After the officials left, Catherine remained in her office as evening shadows lengthened across the museum floors. She thought about her life as it was now, peaceful and fulfilling in its own way, but limited in scope. She had always known that her noble birth came with certain expectations, But she had managed to carve out a career that felt meaningful and personal. The idea of becoming queen was overwhelming, but not entirely foreign. She had grown up understanding duty and service, watching her parents navigate the responsibilities that came with their titles. The question wasn't whether she could fulfill the role, but whether she should accept it under these circumstances. That evening, Catherine drove to her family's estate outside the city. Westmere House sat among rolling hills and ancient oak trees, a testament to centuries of family history. Her father, the Duke, was in his study when she arrived, reading by the fireplace with his two aging spaniels at his feet. "Catherine," he said, rising to embrace her. "What brings you home on a Tuesday evening?" She told him everything, watching his expression shift from surprise to careful consideration as she outlined the palace's proposal. The Duke was a man who had served in diplomatic roles for much of his career, and he understood the complexities of political marriages better than most. "It's a tremendous honor," he said finally, "but also an enormous responsibility. Are you prepared for what this life would entail?" "I'm not sure anyone could be truly prepared," Catherine admitted, "but I understand the duties involved. The question is whether it's fair to His Majesty to enter into such an arrangement when his heart clearly lies elsewhere." Her father was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the firelight. "Catherine, you've always been thoughtful about the choices you make. But you've also always understood the larger picture, the way individual decisions can affect entire communities. You think I should consider it seriously? I think you should meet with His Majesty and have an honest conversation about what you both expect from such a union," the Duke replied. "If you can find a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose, that might be enough to build something worthwhile." The next evening, Catherine arrived at Thornwood Palace as the sun was setting behind the ancient towers. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a simple but elegant black dress that conveyed respect without ostentation. A small staff member escorted her through corridors lined with portraits of previous monarchs, each face seeming to watch her passage with interest. King Alexander was waiting in a small private dining room, far removed from the formal staterooms where official business was conducted. He wore a simple dark suit rather than any military uniform or ceremonial dress, and Catherine was struck by how much older he looked than in his official photographs. "Lady Catherine," he said, rising as she entered. "Thank you for coming. I know this situation is highly unusual." "Your Majesty," she replied, offering a curtsy before accepting the chair he held for her. "Please, for this evening, let's dispense with excessive formality. I think we need to speak honestly about a very complicated situation." Dinner was served quietly, and they made small conversation about Catherine's work and his recent engagements. But both of them were aware of the weight of the real conversation that awaited them. Finally, over coffee, Alexander set down his cup and met Catherine's eyes directly. "I want you to know," he said, "that this was not a decision I came to lightly, and I want you to understand exactly what I would be asking of you." Catherine nodded, appreciating his directness. "I won't pretend that my heart isn't elsewhere," Alexander continued. "Lady Victoria has been an important part of my life for many years. But I've come to realize that sometimes love and duty cannot coexist, and as king, my duty must take precedence." "And you believe marrying me would fulfill that duty?" "I believe," Alexander said carefully, "that you and I could build a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the crown. I've watched you work, Catherine. I've seen your dedication and intelligence. I think we could make a good team." Catherine considered his words. "And Lady Victoria? How does she feel about this decision?" Alexander's expression grew pained. "She understands. In fact, she was the one who helped me realize that continuing as we have been would ultimately harm both the monarchy and our relationship." "That must have been a difficult conversation." "The most difficult of my life," Alexander admitted. "But Victoria is remarkable in her wisdom and her love for this country. She wants what's best for the kingdom, even at personal cost." Catherine felt a surge of respect for the woman who was stepping aside with such grace. It would have been easy for Lady Victoria to fight for her position, but instead she was choosing sacrifice for the greater good. "If I were to agree to this," Catherine said slowly, "what would you expect from our marriage?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I would expect honesty, mutual support in our public duties, and respect for each other's privacy and personal growth. I wouldn't expect you to pretend emotions you don't feel, but I would hope that in time we might develop genuine affection and partnership." "And children?" "The succession does need to be secured," Alexander acknowledged. "But That would be a conversation for us to have as our relationship develops, not an immediate obligation. They talked late into the evening, discussing everything from public responsibilities to personal boundaries, from their hopes for the kingdom to their individual dreams and concerns. By the time Catherine prepared to leave, both of them had a clearer understanding of what their potential union might entail. "I need a few days to make my final decision," Catherine said as Alexander walked her to her car. "Of course," he replied. "This isn't something to be decided hastily." As Catherine drove through the palace gates into the London night, she felt the weight of an entire kingdom's future resting on her shoulders. Tomorrow she would have to decide not just her own fate, but the fate of the monarchy itself. 3 days later, Catherine stood in her apartment overlooking the Thames, watching the morning sun glint off the water as early commuters crossed the bridge below. She had spent the previous days walking through London's parks, visiting her favorite quiet corners of the city, and having long conversations with her father and closest friend. Every perspective offered valid points, but ultimately, she knew the decision had to be her own. Her phone rang precisely at 9 o'clock, the time Sir Edmund had arranged to call for her answer. Catherine took a deep breath before accepting the call. "Sir Edmund, I've made my decision," she said without preamble. "I'm willing to accept His Majesty's proposal, but I have several conditions that must be met." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Lady Catherine. What are your requirements?" "First, I want a formal agreement that outlines the expectations and boundaries of our marriage. Second, I want to continue my work at the museum in some capacity, even if modified. Third, I want assurance that Lady Victoria will be treated with respect and dignity throughout this transition." "I believe all of those conditions can be accommodated," Sir Edmund replied. "His Majesty will be pleased with your decision." "There's one more thing," Catherine added. "I want to meet with Lady Victoria before any announcements are made. If she has concerns about this arrangement, I want to hear them directly." This request clearly surprised Sir Edmund, but he agreed to arrange the meeting. 2 days later, Catherine found herself in the elegant sitting room of Victoria's London townhouse, facing the woman whose place she was about to take. Victoria was even more beautiful in person than in photographs, with a natural grace that came from years of navigating royal circles. She greeted Catherine warmly, serving tea from delicate porcelain cups as if this were simply a social call between friends. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Catherine began, uncertain how to approach such an unprecedented conversation. "Thank you for asking," Victoria replied. "I think it speaks well of your character that you wanted this meeting." They sat in comfortable chairs by tall windows overlooking a small garden, the urban noise of London muffled by thick glass and heavy curtains. Catherine studied Victoria's face, looking for signs of resentment or bitterness, but found only a deep sadness mixed with something that looked like relief. "I need to know," Catherine said carefully, "that I'm not destroying something that could still be saved. If there's any chance that you and His Majesty could find a way forward together, I won't stand in the way." Victoria smiled sadly. "You're very kind, Catherine. But, no, there's no path forward for Alexander and me. We've known this for years, really. We just weren't ready to accept it. You love him very much." "I do," Victoria admitted without hesitation. "I always will. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes circumstances are simply too complex for love to overcome." Catherine set down her teacup, leaning forward slightly. "Can you tell me about him? Not the king, but Alexander the man. What should I know about the person I'm agreeing to marry?" Victoria's expression softened, and, for the next hour, she painted a picture of Alexander that no amount of public observation could have provided. She spoke of his dry sense of humor, his tendency to worry late into the night about decisions affecting his subjects, his love of gardening and old films, his struggle with the weight of expectations placed on him since childhood. "He's fundamentally good," Victoria concluded. "Sometimes the burden of the crown makes him seem distant or formal, but underneath all that protocol is a man who genuinely cares about doing right by his people." "And you think he can be happy in a marriage based on partnership rather than passion?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "I think Alexander has never had the chance to discover what a true partnership could feel like. His marriage to Isabella was arranged when they were both too young to understand what they needed from a relationship. What he and I had was intense, but also complicated by all the external pressures." She paused, looking out at her garden where autumn was beginning to touch the leaves. "Perhaps what he needs now is something calmer, more stable. A foundation he can build on without constant worry about political ramifications." "And you? What will you do now?" "I'm moving to France," Victoria said, surprising Catherine with the directness of her plan. I have family there, and I've been offered a position with an international children's charity. It will be good to have work that feels meaningful, away from all the scrutiny and speculation. Catherine felt a pang of sympathy for this woman who was sacrificing so much with such grace. Will you stay in touch with him? No, Victoria said firmly. A clean break is best for everyone involved. Alexander needs to be free to build something new without being haunted by the past. Their conversation was interrupted by Victoria's housekeeper, who announced that a car had arrived from the palace. Catherine realized this was her signal to leave, the final step before crossing into a completely different life. As they stood to say goodbye, Victoria took Catherine's hands in hers. I want you to know, she said, that I think you're making the right choice. For yourself, for Alexander, and for the kingdom. You have qualities that will serve you well as queen. What qualities? Catherine asked, genuinely curious about Victoria's perspective. You're thoughtful without being indecisive. You're intelligent without being arrogant. And, most importantly, you understand that sometimes the greatest strength is in choosing duty over personal desire. Catherine left Victoria's townhouse feeling both heavy-hearted and resolved. The car took her directly to Thornwood Palace, where Alexander was waiting in the same private study where he had made his difficult decision just a week earlier. Catherine, he said, rising as she entered. The relief in his voice was unmistakable. Sir Edmund told me of your decision. I want you to know how grateful I am. We need to discuss how this will work, Catherine replied, taking a seat across from his desk. I meant what I said about wanting clear expectations and boundaries. For the next several hours, they worked through the practical details of their arrangement. They discussed living situations, public appearances, the timeline for their engagement and wedding, and the delicate matter of how to handle the transition from Alexander's relationship with Victoria to his marriage with Catherine. I want our wedding to be beautiful, Catherine said as they neared the end of their discussion. Not because I need a fairy tale celebration, but because the people deserve to see something hopeful and positive. They need to believe this is a new beginning, not just a political necessity. Alexander looked surprised by her perspective. You've thought about the public perception. Of course I have. If we're asking the people to accept this marriage and support us as their monarchs, we need to give them reasons to be enthusiastic about the future. And you think we can do that? Make them believe in us. Catherine met his gaze steadily. I think we can make them believe in what we represent together. Stability, commitment to service, respect for tradition while moving toward the future. Those are things worth believing in. You sound like you could be a very good queen, Alexander said. And, for the first time since their conversations began, Catherine heard something in his voice that might have been the beginning of genuine affection. I hope so, she replied. Because once this is announced, there's no going back for either of us. The official announcement came 3 weeks later, carefully orchestrated to emphasize the positive aspects of the union while respectfully acknowledging the end of Alexander's relationship with Victoria. The public response was mixed but generally favorable, with most commentators focusing on Catherine's impressive background and the stability the marriage would bring to the succession. Catherine threw herself into preparation for her new role with the same dedication she had brought to her museum work. She studied constitutional law, met with advisors about royal protocol, and began the process of gradually taking on public engagements alongside Alexander. Their first official appearance together was at the annual Arts Foundation Gala, an event that allowed Catherine to showcase her expertise while supporting one of the Crown's charitable initiatives. As they walked into the venue, Alexander offered her his arm, and Catherine was surprised by how natural the gesture felt. You look lovely, he said quietly as camera flashes illuminated their entrance. And, more importantly, you look comfortable. I'm learning, Catherine replied, smiling at the assembled crowd. We both are. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself enjoying the conversations with artists, patrons, and cultural leaders. Alexander watched her interact with genuine interest and enthusiasm, seeing qualities he hadn't fully appreciated during their formal negotiations. During dinner, as Catherine discussed plans for expanding public access to historical collections, Alexander realized he was listening not as a king hearing from an advisor, but as a man discovering something new about the woman he was going to marry. You know, he said during a quiet moment between courses, I think we might actually enjoy being married to each other. Catherine looked at him in surprise, then smiled. I hope so, Alexander. I really do. The engagement period passed more smoothly than either of them had expected. They developed an easy companionship based on shared responsibilities and mutual respect. Catherine proved to be an excellent sounding board for Alexander's decisions, offering perspectives he hadn't considered and asking questions that helped him think through complex issues. On their wedding day, 6 months after Victoria had walked out of the palace for the last time, Catherine stood in Westminster Abbey wearing a gown that honored both tradition and her personal style. As she walked down the aisle, she caught sight of Alexander waiting at the altar, and, for the first time, she saw not the burdened king she had initially met, but a man who looked hopeful about the future. Their vows were traditional, but when Alexander promised to honor and cherish her, Catherine heard sincerity in his words that went beyond mere duty. When she promised to support him in all things, she meant it completely. As they emerged from the abbey as husband and wife, the crowd's cheers were genuine and enthusiastic. The people saw what Catherine and Alexander were beginning to discover themselves, that sometimes the best foundations for lasting partnership are built on respect, shared purpose, and the gradual growth of affection rather than the intensity of passion. That evening, as they stood together on the palace balcony acknowledging the crowds below, Alexander took Catherine's hand naturally, without thinking about protocol or political necessity. "Thank you," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone despite the thousands of people watching. "For what?" Catherine asked. "For choosing this. For choosing us. I know it wasn't an easy decision." Catherine squeezed his hand, looking out at the sea of faces turned toward them with hope and celebration. "I think," she said, "it might turn out to be the best decision either of us has ever made." As the sun set behind them and the crowds gradually dispersed, King Alexander and Queen Catherine stood together, no longer bound merely by duty and political necessity, but by the beginning of something deeper and more enduring than either had expected to find.